Samuel Whitman stood at the edge of the cemetery, the October wind slicing through his woolen coat as he watched the men lower his wife's casket into the frozen Massachusetts earth. He clutched the hands of his three daughters, Elizabeth, 12, Catherine, 10, and little Mary, barely 7, their faces pale as the approaching winter. The year was 1893, and the influenza that had claimed Martha Whitman had ravaged half of Blackstone County. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," intoned Reverend Harris, his words swallowed by the wind. Samuel nodded mechanically, but inside, fury burned. What kind of God would take a mother from her children? What mercy was there in that? He had prayed endlessly at Martha's bedside, begging for divine intervention. None came. That evening, as the girls slept fitfully in their shared bedroom, Samuel sat alone in his study, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. The family Bible lay open, its pages fluttering in the draught from the poorly sealed window. For 20 years, Samuel had been a devoted parishioner at Blackstone First Episcopal, had tithed faithfully, had raised his daughters in Christian virtue. For what? A knock at the door startled him from his bitter reverie. At this hour, he considered ignoring it, but the knocking persisted, urgent. When Samuel opened the door, he found a tall, gaunt man dressed in black clerical garb standing on his porch. The stranger's face was sharp-featured, almost skeletal, his eyes so deeply set they seemed to recede into shadow. "Mr. Whitman," the man said, his voice surprisingly melodious, "I am Pastor Edmund Gray. I've come about your spiritual welfare." "Reverend Harris already called this morning," Samuel replied warily. "I am not from your church, sir. I represent a different path to salvation." Samuel nearly closed the door, but something in Gray's piercing gaze held him. "My wife is dead. What salvation can there be for me now?" Pastor Gray's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "One that does not leave you helpless in the face of death, one that gives you power over it." Samuel should have sent the man away. Later he would recall this moment, this threshold, and wonder how differently things might have unfolded had he simply closed the door. But grief and whiskey had weakened his judgment, and the promises the pastor offered sounded too sweet to reject. "Come in," Samuel said, stepping aside, "but speak quietly. My daughters are sleeping." As Pastor Gray crossed the threshold, a strange chill seemed to enter with him. Samuel attributed it to the night air, closed the door, and led the visitor to his study, unaware that he had just invited a darkness into his home that would consume everything he loved. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman," Gray said as he settled into a chair, refusing the offered whiskey, "do you believe that God has abandoned you?" "I," Samuel hesitated. Such thoughts felt blasphemous to voice aloud. "You need not fear judgment from me," Gray assured him. "I have seen too many good men broken by conventional faith when true trials arise." Samuel's shoulders slumped. "I prayed. I begged. She suffered for weeks." Gray nodded sympathetically. "The church teaches us to accept God's will without question. But I ask you, what father stands idle while his children suffer? What loving creator denies mercy to the faithful?" By midnight, Samuel's head swam with Gray's words that challenged everything he had been taught, yet resonated with his raw grief. The pastor spoke of ancient traditions, of prayers that did not merely beseech but commanded, of a covenant more binding than the watered-down faith of modern churches. "Your home," Gray observed, "would make an ideal sanctuary." "The basement, perhaps?" "We have no basement," Samuel replied, "but there is a space beneath the parlor floor, a root cellar of sorts." Gray's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. We shall begin tomorrow." As the strange pastor finally took his leave, Samuel felt a curious mixture of hope and unease. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. Upstairs, little Mary Whitman stirred in her sleep, troubled by dreams of a tall man with hungry eyes, who stood at the foot of her bed, whispering words she couldn't understand, but somehow feared. By December, The Whitman household had undergone a transformation. The root cellar beneath the parlor had been expanded, the dirt floor replaced with wooden planking arranged in concentric circles. Pews, salvaged from an abandoned church in neighboring Millville, now filled the space, facing a crude altar fashioned from local oak. Samuel had told curious neighbors that the construction was for additional storage, to prepare for the harsh winter ahead. Few questioned him. A widower with 3 young daughters had enough challenges without nosy interference. Pastor Gray now lived with them, occupying the guest room that had once belonged to Martha's mother. The girls were uneasy around him, particularly Mary, who would hide whenever he entered a room. Elizabeth, the eldest, voiced her concerns to her father. "He watches us, Papa," she said one evening while helping with supper. "When you're not looking, it makes my skin feel cold." Samuel dismissed her fears. "Pastor Gray has been a blessing to this family, Elizabeth. Without his guidance, I might have been lost to despair." Elizabeth wanted to argue but held her tongue. Since their mother's death, her father had changed. The tender man who once read them bedtime stories now spent hours in the converted cellar with Gray, emerging with bloodshot eyes and a strange fervor in his speech. That night, a heavy snow fell, blanketing Blackston County in white silence. Samuel called the girls to the parlor after dinner. "We will be holding a special service tonight," he announced. "Pastor Gray believes it's time." "Time for what, Papa?" Catherine asked. Samuel's eyes shone with an unsettling brightness. Time to bridge the divide, to speak across the veil. The girls exchanged worried glances as their father moved the large oriental rug that had been their mother's pride, revealing the trapdoor to the converted cellar below. Pastor Gray appeared in the doorway, dressed in ceremonial robes of deep crimson. "The children must wear white," he instructed. "Purity is essential for the ritual." "Ritual?" Elizabeth's voice sharpened. "Papa, what is he talking about?" Samuel's face hardened. "Do as Pastor Gray says, Elizabeth. This is for your mother." The girls were sent to change into their Sunday dresses. In their bedroom, Elizabeth locked the door and turned to her sisters. "Something is wrong," she whispered. "Pastor Gray is not a good man." Catherine nodded, her face pale. "I heard them talking last night. About sacrifices." "What kind of sacrifices?" Mary asked, eyes wide with childish fear. Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to be careful." A loud knock rattled the door. "Girls!" came their father's voice, strained with impatience. "Pastor Gray is waiting." The makeshift chapel beneath the house glowed with dozens of candles. The air was thick with incense that smelled nothing like the familiar frankincense of their Episcopal church. This was heavier, more cloying, with an underlying scent like copper and decay. The girls were seated in the front pew, with Samuel beside them. Pastor Gray stood at the altar, upon which rested several objects: a silver chalice, a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin, and a long ceremonial knife with symbols etched into its blade. "We gather tonight," Gray began, his voice echoing unnaturally in the small space, "to open the doorway between worlds." The service that followed bore little resemblance to any Christian ceremony the girls had attended. Gray spoke in a language Elizabeth didn't recognize, guttural and ancient-sounding. Their father responded at certain intervals, his eyes closed in rapture. When Gray raised the knife, Elizabeth grabbed her sister's hands. "In the old ways," Gray proclaimed, now in English, "communion required true sacrifice. Blood freely given strengthens our petition." To the girls' horror, their father stood and approached the altar. Gray handed him the knife, and without hesitation, Samuel drew the blade across his palm, allowing blood to drip into the chalice. "The essence of life," Gray intoned, "to call forth those beyond the veil." "Papa, no!" Mary cried out, but it was too late. Gray raised the chalice, now partially filled with Samuel's blood, and began to chant. The candles flickered violently, though there was no draught in the sealed room. Elizabeth felt it first, a pressure in her ears, a sensation of something massive pressing inward from all sides. Catherine began to weep silently beside her. Mary clutched her sister's hand so tightly her nails drew blood. Then came the voices, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Unintelligible at first, then coalescing into a single name, repeated over and over, "Martha, Martha, Martha." Samuel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "She's here," he gasped. "My Martha is here." But the presence that filled the room felt nothing like their gentle mother. Elizabeth sensed a malevolence, a hunger that had merely borrowed a beloved name to gain entry. Grey's eyes locked with Elizabeth's, and in that moment she knew with terrible certainty that whatever they had summoned was not their mother, and that Pastor Grey had never intended it to be. January brought relentless snowstorms that isolated the Whitman house from the rest of Blackstone. The girls were no longer permitted to attend school. Pastor Grey insisted they needed special education under his guidance. Samuel, now completely under the pastor's influence, acquiesced to every demand. The nightly services continued, growing increasingly elaborate. Samuel had sold several valuable family heirlooms, including Martha's diamond engagement ring, to purchase supplies for the rituals. Gold candlesticks, silver ceremonial bowls, and rare incense now adorned the underground chapel. Elizabeth tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her younger sisters, but it was becoming impossible. Catherine had developed a persistent cough that worsened after each ceremony in the damp cellar. Mary had stopped speaking altogether, communicating only in nods or shakes of her head, her eyes constantly wide with fear. One afternoon, while Pastor Grey and their father were in town acquiring more supplies, Elizabeth decided to investigate the chapel. She had noticed that after each ritual, Grey would carefully lock the skin-bound book in a cedar chest beside the altar. "Watch for them from the window," she instructed Catherine. "Mary, come with me." Using a hairpin as her mother had once shown her, Martha had always been practical despite her genteel upbringing. Elizabeth picked the simple lock on the trapdoor. The sisters descended into the chilled darkness, lighting a single candle to guide their way. The chapel felt different without the ceremonial preparations, smaller, shabbier, and somehow more sinister. Elizabeth approached the cedar chest, surprised to find it unlocked. "He must have been in a hurry," she whispered to Mary, who stood trembling beside her. The book inside was heavier than it looked. Opening it released a musty odor that made both girls recoil. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in handwritten text and disturbing illustrations. Though Elizabeth was well educated for a girl of 12, much of the writing was in languages she couldn't decipher, but certain passages in English caught her attention. The transference requires innocent vessels, purified through ceremony. 3 female sacrifices, virgins preferred, aligned with the lunar phases. Resurrection is possible when the ordained priest consumes the essence. Elizabeth's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the book. "Mary," she whispered, "we have to leave. Tonight." Before Mary could respond, Catherine's urgent voice called from above, "They're coming back! Hurry!" The girls barely had time to replace the book and scramble up the ladder before they heard the front door open. They rushed to their bedroom, hearts pounding. "What did you find?" Catherine asked, her cough punctuating the question. Elizabeth pulled her sisters close. "Pastor Grey doesn't want to bring Mother back," she said, her voice breaking. "He wants to use us to bring something else through, something terrible. What do we do?" Catherine's face was flushed with fever. Elizabeth thought quickly. "We need help. Mrs. Winters might—" The bedroom door swung open, revealing Pastor Grey's tall figure. His gaunt face showed no expression, but his eyes burned with cold fury. "Such curious little lambs," he said softly. "Did you find answers to your questions, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth pushed her sisters behind her. "We know what you're planning." Grey smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Do you?" "I doubt that very much, child." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Your father is preparing for tonight's ceremony. It's a special occasion, the full moon, you see, perfect for what must be done. We won't participate anymore, Elizabeth declared, though her voice trembled. Gray's smile widened. Your participation is not optional, dear one. It is essential. The doorway has been opened. It requires completion. Our mother would never want this, Catherine said, finding her courage. Gray laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your mother? You still believe this is about your mother? He moved closer, looming over them. Your father's grief made him an easy vessel for suggestion, but this was never about bringing Martha Whitman back from the dead. Then what? Elizabeth demanded. Gray's face changed, subtly at first, then with increasing distortion, his features seeming to shift beneath his skin like something wearing an ill-fitting mask. Rebirth, he whispered, his voice now layered with other voices. A new vessel, 3 sacrifices to make one body, and your father will provide the final ingredient, willing surrender of his bloodline. Elizabeth lunged for the door, but Gray moved with impossible speed, blocking their escape. The preparations are complete, he said. Tonight your father believes he will embrace his beloved wife again. Instead, he will witness the birth of something magnificent, something that has waited centuries for this moment. From below they heard Samuel calling, "Pastor Gray, are the girls ready?" Gray's face settled back into its human mask. "Yes, Mr. Whitman," he called back. "We're coming now." He turned to the girls, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not a word, or your father dies screaming before your eyes." As Gray herded them toward the stairs, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of her mother's silver hand mirror on the dresser. In one desperate motion, she grabbed it and concealed it in the folds of her dress. If they couldn't escape, perhaps they could at least reflect whatever unholy presence Gray had summoned back upon itself. It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. The underground chapel had been transformed for the evening ceremony. Black candles replaced the white ones of previous rituals. The walls were now adorned with symbols painted in a rusty substance that Elizabeth feared was blood. At the center of the altar stood 3 golden chalices, arranged in a triangle. Samuel waited for them, dressed in ceremonial robes matching Gray's crimson garments. His eyes were feverish, his movements jerky and uncertain. "My girls," he said, embracing each of them with trembling hands. "Tonight, we bring your mother home." Elizabeth searched her father's face for any sign of the man he had been, the loving parent who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had patiently explained arithmetic at the kitchen table, who had wept openly when Mary was born. She found nothing but desperate madness. "Papa," she attempted, "this isn't right. Mother wouldn't—" "Silence," Gray commanded, his voice reverberating unnaturally. "The time for doubt has passed." He directed the girls to stand before the altar, positioning them precisely within the circular patterns on the floor. Samuel took his place opposite them, swaying slightly, as if in a trance. "The vessels have been prepared," Gray proclaimed. "The gateway has been opened. Now we call forth that which waits beyond." He began to chant in that same ancient language, the words seeming to distort the air around them. Samuel joined in, his voice a hollow echo of the pastor's invocation. Elizabeth felt the mirror pressing against her leg through her dress pocket. She glanced at Catherine, whose cough had subsided, but whose face was alarmingly pale. Mary stood rigid with terror, her small hand cold in Elizabeth's grasp. The temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath clouded before them as Gray's chanting intensified. The black candles flared unnaturally bright, then dimmed to barely visible blue flames. "The first vessel," Gray announced, turning to face Catherine. Elizabeth moved to shield her sister, but invisible forces held her in place. Catherine was dragged forward by nothing tangible, her feet scraping across the wooden floor as she struggled against the pull. Gray handed Samuel the ceremonial knife. "The blood of your blood," he instructed, "freely given for the greater communion." Samuel raised the knife, his hand shaking. For a moment, Elizabeth saw doubt cross his face. a flicker of the father they had known. "Papa, please," Elizabeth begged. "This isn't what Mother would want. You know that." Samuel hesitated, the knife wavering in his grip, Gray's face contorted with rage. "Do not falter now, Samuel Whitman, not when we are so close." Samuel looked at Catherine's terrified face. "I don't." With a snarl of frustration, Gray snatched the knife from Samuel's hand. "Weak fool," he spat. "I will do what you cannot." As Gray raised the blade toward Catherine, Elizabeth summoned every ounce of strength to break whatever force held her. With a cry of desperation, she lunged forward, pulling the silver mirror from her pocket. "In the name of our mother," she shouted, thrusting the mirror between Gray and her sister. The pastor's reflection caught in the polished silver, but it was not his face that appeared. The mirror revealed a twisted, inhuman visage, with too many eyes and a maw filled with needle-like teeth. Gray screamed, a sound no human throat could produce, as the reflection seemed to pull at him, distorting his physical form. The mirror grew hot in Elizabeth's hand, burning her palm, but she held it steady. "Papa!" she cried out. "Help us!" Something broke in Samuel then, the spell of grief and manipulation that had clouded his mind for months. With a roar of paternal fury, he tackled Gray from behind, sending them both crashing into the altar. The chalices toppled, spilling their contents. Not wine, but a thick, black substance that hissed where it touched the floor. "Take your sisters and run!" Samuel commanded as he struggled with the thrashing pastor. Elizabeth grabbed Catherine and Mary, pulling them toward the ladder. Behind them, Gray was changing, his human disguise sloughing away like melting wax to reveal the horror beneath. "You cannot escape!" The thing that had been Pastor Gray shrieked. "The doorway is open! It must be fed!" Samuel, seeing his daughters reach the ladder, made a final, desperate decision. He seized one of the fallen black candles and thrust it into the spilled liquid from the chalices. The substance ignited instantly, blue-white flames racing across the floor in unnatural patterns, following the circular designs carved into the wood. Gray, or the entity wearing his form, howled as the flames surrounded him. "Go!" Samuel shouted to his daughters, who had reached the top of the ladder. "I'll hold him here!" Elizabeth met her father's eyes one last time. In them she saw regret, love, and grim determination. "I'm sorry," he mouthed as the flames rose higher. The girls stumbled into the parlor, choking on the smoke now billowing from the open trapdoor. From below came sounds no human should ever hear, the rage of something ancient being denied its prize, the prayers of a father seeking redemption through sacrifice. Elizabeth led her sisters out into the snow-covered night, not stopping until they reached the road. Behind them, orange flames began to consume the Whitman house, illuminating the winter darkness with hellish light. The three Whitman sisters huddled together in the snow, watching their home burn against the night sky. The bitter January cold bit through their thin ceremonial dresses, but none of them felt they could move closer to the infernal heat radiating from the collapsing structure. "Papa," Mary whispered, breaking her months-long silence. It was the only word any of them could manage. Elizabeth clutched the silver mirror, now cool against her burned palm. Its surface was cracked from center to edge, as though something had tried to break through from the other side. Distant shouts announced the arrival of neighbors. The Winters family from the adjacent farm had seen the flames and alerted others. Soon, a crowd gathered at a safe distance from the conflagration, murmuring in shock and organizing a bucket brigade from the nearby well, a futile gesture against the supernatural intensity of the blaze. Mrs. Winters found the girls and wrapped them in horse blankets from her wagon. "Lord, have mercy!" she exclaimed, noting their ceremonial attire and vacant expressions. "What happened here? Where is your father, and that pastor who's been staying with you?" Elizabeth couldn't form the words to explain. How could she describe what they had witnessed? Who would believe that their father had nearly sacrificed them at the behest of a creature masquerading as a man of God? "An accident," she finally managed. "They couldn't get out." The sisters were taken to the Winters farm for the night. The community, already gossiping about the strange changes in Samuel Whitman since his wife's death, would construct their own narrative about the tragedy. A widower driven mad by grief, led astray by a charlatan preacher, culminating in a terrible accident that orphaned 3 innocent girls. Only Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary would know the truth. Dawn revealed the full extent of the destruction. Nothing remained of the Whitman house but smouldering ruins and the blackened stone foundation. County officials arrived to assess the scene and document the incident. 2 bodies, the sheriff informed Mrs. Winters, within earshot of Elizabeth, who had insisted on returning to the site. Burned beyond recognition, but it must be the father and that pastor fellow. Elizabeth said nothing, but clutched the cracked mirror tighter. The coroner, examining the charred cellar where the bodies were found, was baffled by what remained. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered to his assistant. "The floor patterns, like some kind of church setup, and these markings on the walls." The Whitman sisters were sent to live with their mother's sister in Boston, Aunt Harriet, a stern but fair-minded woman who had never approved of Samuel's religious fervor even before Pastor Gray's appearance. "You'll speak of none of this," she instructed them upon their arrival at her Beacon Hill townhouse. "Whatever happened in that house dies with it. You're Whitmans. You'll carry yourselves with dignity despite this tragedy." And for the most part, they did. The girls attended proper schools, learned appropriate social graces, and eventually entered Boston society as young women of modest means but good breeding. Catherine recovered from her mysterious illness, though her health remained fragile. Mary gradually began speaking again, though she would never become as talkative as other girls her age. Elizabeth, however, could not fully embrace the normal life her aunt prescribed. The cracked mirror remained hidden among her possessions, wrapped in silk and sealed in a box of cedar, like the one that had held Gray's terrible book. At night, she sometimes thought she heard whispers emanating from it, calling her name in her father's voice. 5 years after the fire, when Elizabeth was 17, a package arrived addressed to all 3 sisters. It contained documents from a Blackstone County lawyer, the deed to the Whitman property, and a small insurance policy Samuel had taken out months before his death. "You should sell the land," Aunt Harriet advised. "Nothing good can come of holding on to it." But Elizabeth insisted they keep it. "It's all we have left of our parents," she argued. The truth, which she shared only with her sisters, was that she feared what might happen if others built upon that cursed ground. Whatever doorway had been opened might not have fully closed. The thing that had worn Pastor Gray's face had said as much. By 1905, Elizabeth Whitman had become something of an anomaly in Boston society. At 24, she remained unmarried, despite her fine education and pleasant appearance. She had instead focused on scholarly pursuits, securing a position as a research assistant at Harvard's Widener Library, unusual for a woman, but made possible by her exceptional knowledge of rare books and ancient languages. Catherine had married a young doctor named James Ellsworth, who had treated her during a recurrence of her respiratory ailments. They lived in Cambridge with their infant son, whom they had named Samuel, despite Elizabeth's objections. Mary, now 19, was studying music at the New England Conservatory, her former silence transformed into a remarkable talent for the violin. Of the 3 sisters, she seemed the least affected by their childhood trauma, at least on the surface. Elizabeth's work at the library had a hidden purpose. Over the years, she had been researching occult texts similar to the one Pastor Gray had used in his ceremonies. She needed to understand what had really happened that night, what entity had nearly claimed them, and whether her father's sacrifice had truly ended the threat. On a rainy April afternoon, Professor Armitage, an elderly scholar of obscure religions, approached her desk with a leather-bound volume. "Miss Whitman, I believe you'll find this of particular interest," he said, his voice lowered despite the library's emptiness. "It arrived in our most recent acquisition from an estate in Salem. The marginalia alone is extraordinary." Elizabeth opened the book carefully. Her breath caught in her throat. Though not identical to Gray's book, the similarities were unmistakable, the same ancient symbols, the same references to vessels and doorways. "Where did you say this came from?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "The Putnam estate. The executor found a hidden compartment in the study wall during cataloguing. This was inside, along with some rather disturbing personal journals." Armitage hesitated. "Miss Whitman, there's something else. The journals mention a Pastor Gray who visited the family in 1889. The entries stop abruptly after his arrival." Elizabeth's hands trembled. May I see these journals?" "That's why I brought this to your attention. The executor is a friend. I can arrange access." The Putnam journals revealed a pattern identical to what had happened with her family. A grieving widower, 3 daughters, a charismatic pastor offering unorthodox comfort. But in the Putnam case, the ritual had apparently been completed. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, unlike the meticulous script of previous entries, contained just 5 words: "My daughters are with me." Historical records showed that the Putnam house had burned to the ground in 1889, reportedly killing the entire family. But one detail chilled Elizabeth to her core. A witness claimed to have seen 4 figures walking away from the fire, a man and 3 young girls, though no survivors were ever officially documented. That evening, Elizabeth sent urgent telegrams to her sisters, requesting they meet at her apartment immediately. By nightfall, they were assembled in her small sitting room, the cracked mirror lying exposed on the table between them. "He wasn't the first," Elizabeth explained, showing them the journal copies she'd made. "And I fear he wasn't the last." Catherine, who had matured into a pragmatic young woman, frowned. "Even if this is true, what can we do about it now? It's been 12 years. I've continued to pay taxes on our family property," Elizabeth replied. "No one has built there. The land remains vacant." Mary, who had been silently examining the mirror, finally spoke. "It's not over, is it? Whatever was trying to come through?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't think so. In my research, I've found references to entities that exist beyond conventional death. They can be banished but not destroyed. Not completely." "What are you suggesting?" Catherine asked, her hand instinctively moving to the locket that contained a portrait of her son. "We need to go back," Elizabeth said firmly, "to Blackstone, to finish what our father started." Mary's fingers traced the crack in the mirror. "I've had dreams," she admitted, "for years now. I see Papa, but not Papa. He's calling to us from beneath the ashes." The 3 sisters exchanged looks of grim understanding. Their childhood tragedy had merely been postponed, not averted. Whatever had begun in that makeshift chapel remained unresolved. "I won't risk my family," Catherine protested, though without conviction. "If we don't end this," Elizabeth countered, "it may eventually find us anyway, or worse, find your son." The mention of her child settled the matter for Catherine. 3 days later, the Whitman sisters boarded a train for Blackstone County, the cracked mirror carefully packed among their belongings, along with items Elizabeth had gathered through her research, objects of power and protection from traditions far older than Pastor Gray's corrupted ceremonies. As the train carried them back toward their childhood home, Elizabeth stared out at the passing landscape. She had spent over a decade preparing for this confrontation, though she had tried to deny its inevitability. Now, returning to where it all began, she finally accepted the truth she had always known. The doorway had never fully closed, and something was still waiting on the other side, wearing their father's face. Blackstone County had changed little in the 12 years since the Whitman sisters had fled. The same Victorian houses lined the main street, the same church spires punctuated the skyline. Yet to Elizabeth, everything felt smaller, diminished by adult eyes that had seen the wider world. They took rooms at the Blackstone Inn, where the proprietor, Mrs. Calloway, remembered them instantly. "The Whitman girls returned at last," she exclaimed, studying their faces. "Such a terrible tragedy. Your poor father. He was never the same after your mother passed." Elizabeth nodded politely, but offered no conversation about their family history. After settling into their rooms, the sisters met privately to finalize their plans. "I visited the county records office this afternoon," Elizabeth informed them, spreading a map on the small writing desk. "Our property remains as we left it, untouched and unoccupied." "Deliberately untouched," Mary added quietly. "Did you notice how the townspeople watched us? They crossed the street to avoid passing the property. Children dare each other to touch the gate." Catherine sighed, adjusting her hatpin. "Superstition. Rural communities always embellish tragedies." "In this case," Elizabeth replied, "their instincts serve them well. The land is tainted." That evening, under cover of darkness, the sisters made their way to the ruins of their childhood home. The stone foundation remained, now overgrown with weeds and brambles. The cellar where their makeshift chapel had been was a shallow depression filled with stagnant rainwater. Elizabeth removed the mirror from its wrappings and held it up to catch the moonlight. The crack had deepened over the years, branching out like a web across the once flawless surface. "I can feel it," Mary whispered, her musical training having heightened her sensitivity to vibrations and resonances. "Something beneath us, waiting." And they formed a circle around the cellar depression, each holding items Elizabeth had prepared. Catherine a silver bell, Mary a bundle of herbs bound with red thread, Elizabeth the cracked mirror, and a small bottle of what she claimed was holy water, though from no church the others recognized. "We must recreate the circle," Elizabeth instructed, "but with our intentions reversed. Not to open, but to seal forever." Working methodically, they cleared debris from the foundation stones that had once supported the parlor floor. Using chalk infused with salt and iron filings, Elizabeth drew symbols counter to those Pastor Gray had painted. Symbols she had discovered in her years of research, meant to bind rather than release. As midnight approached, the air grew unnaturally still. Even the night insects fell silent. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the April air. "It knows," Catherine murmured, her skepticism faltering as frost formed on the surrounding weeds. Elizabeth positioned the mirror at the center of their circle, directly above where the altar had stood. "When I begin the invocation, whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, do not break the circle. Do not respond to anything it says, especially if it wears a familiar face." She began to recite words in a language her sisters didn't recognize, not the guttural tongue Gray had used, but something older, more melodic. The chalk lines began to glow with a soft blue luminescence, pulsing like a heartbeat. The stagnant water in the cellar depression began to bubble, not as if from heat, but as though something were rising from below. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Then came the voices, whispers at first, gradually growing louder. Not the nameless entity Gray had summoned, but familiar voices. Their mother calling for help, their father begging forgiveness. "Don't listen," Elizabeth warned, her voice strained as she continued the ritual. The whispers became more desperate, more seductive, promises of family reunion, of healing old wounds, of answers to questions that had haunted them for years. Mary's resolve wavered first. "I can see him," she gasped. "Papa is standing right there, beyond the circle." Elizabeth didn't dare look where her sister pointed. "It's not him, Mary. Remember what we saw that night. Remember what Pastor Gray became." But the apparition was compelling. A figure had indeed formed at the edge of their circle. Samuel Whitman, as they remembered him before Gray's influence, his eyes kind, his hands outstretched toward his daughters. "My girls," it said in their father's voice, "I've waited so long for you to return, to explain everything." Catherine's hand holding the silver bell began to lower. He looked so real. "The bell, Catherine," Elizabeth commanded sharply. "Ring it now." The sharp clarity of the bell cut through the night, momentarily disrupting the apparition. It flickered, revealing something else beneath the beloved features, something ancient and malevolent. "Now, Mary," Elizabeth cried. Mary cast her bundle of herbs into the depression. They ignited spontaneously upon contact with the water, sending up purplish flames and acrid smoke. The thing wearing their father's face snarled, its features contorting. "Ungrateful children," it hissed, the voice no longer Samuel's, but a chorus of hateful whispers. "Your father gave himself willingly. His essence sustained me all these years, waiting for you to return and complete what was begun." Elizabeth raised the mirror, pointing its cracked surface directly at the entity. "Show yourself," she commanded, "not as our father, but as what you truly are." The apparition writhed, its form stretching and distorting like heated wax. Samuel's familiar features melted away, revealing glimpses of something too horrific to comprehend fully, a mass of eyes, teeth, and appendages that had never existed in the natural world. "You cannot banish me," it growled, the ground shaking with each syllable. The doorway was opened with Whitman blood. Only Whitman blood can seal it, all of it, freely given. Elizabeth felt a chill at these words. Gray's book had mentioned a similar requirement, willing sacrifice. Had their father understood this in his final moments? "We are not here to banish you," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite her terror. "We are here to bind you, forever." She uncorked the bottle of holy water, collected not from a Christian font, but from 7 sacred wells across Europe, each dedicated to deities far older than the church. As she poured it onto the mirror, the liquid seemed to hover above the cracked surface, not wetting it, but forming patterns that matched the chalk symbols around them. "By the old powers that existed before your kind," Elizabeth intoned, reciting words she had memorized from texts hidden in Harvard's most restricted collections. "By the covenant of earth and water, fire and air, we bind you to this place." The entity howled, lunging against an invisible barrier at the edge of their circle. The ground split further, the depression widening as though something massive were trying to force its way through from below. "Mary, Catherine, your blood," Elizabeth said urgently. "Just a drop, freely given, place it on the mirror." Catherine hesitated only briefly before pressing her fingertip to a sharp edge of the cracked glass. Mary followed suit. Elizabeth did the same, completing the triangle of Whitman blood on the mirror's surface. "3 daughters," Elizabeth continued, "to counter 3 vessels. What our father began in fire, we complete in blood and will." The droplets of blood seemed to sink into the mirror, disappearing into the crack at its center. The glass began to glow with an inner light, pulsing in rhythm with the chalk lines surrounding them. The entity thrashed more violently, its form becoming increasingly unstable. "You cannot hold me," it shrieked. "I am eternal. I have worn 1,000 faces, devoured 1,000 souls." "Yet you will not have ours," Elizabeth replied. With a final, decisive motion, she turned the mirror over and pressed it face down into the earth, directly above where the altar had once stood. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ground beneath them convulsed, a terrible pressure built in the air, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The entity's form collapsed inward, drawn inexorably toward the buried mirror. "Hold the circle!" Elizabeth shouted as winds whipped around them, threatening to break their formation. The sisters stood firm, their hands linked, as the thing that had nearly destroyed their family was pulled screaming into the mirror, not banished to its own realm, but trapped between worlds in the fractured glass. A final, deafening concussion shook the foundation. The glowing chalk lines flared blindingly bright, then faded to dull ash. The winds died instantly. The oppressive presence that had hung over the property for 12 years vanished, leaving only the ordinary sounds of a spring night. For several minutes, none of the sisters spoke. They remained in their circle, hands linked, scarcely believing what they had accomplished. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. Is it truly over?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "The mirror is now its prison. So long as it remains buried here, sealed with our blood and the symbols of binding, the entity cannot escape." Mary looked around at the ruined foundation, now somehow less menacing in the moonlight. "What about Papa and Pastor Gray?" Elizabeth sighed, releasing her sister's hands. Gray was never human, I think, or hadn't been for a very long time. As for father, she paused, considering the complex truth. Part of him may have been consumed, but I believe his final act was one of love and sacrifice. He chose to burn with Gray rather than let the entity take us. What do we do now? Catherine asked practically. Elizabeth had considered this question for years. We ensure no one ever builds here again. We create a trust using the insurance money to maintain this land as a memorial garden, and we make certain the mirror is never disturbed. The sisters worked through the night, digging a proper grave for the mirror at the center of the foundation, reinforcing its prison with layers of salt, iron, and silver coins. Above it, they placed a simple stone marker inscribed with a warning disguised as a memorial. Sacred ground, do not disturb, in memory of the Whitman family. By dawn, their work was complete. Exhausted but resolute, they stood together at the edge of the property, watching the sunrise illuminate the scene of their childhood trauma and their adult triumph. We should return yearly, Elizabeth suggested, to check the seals, to remember. Catherine nodded. I'll bring my son when he's old enough to understand. The Whitman blood continues through him. He should know his heritage and his responsibility. Mary gazed thoughtfully at the stone marker. Do you think mother and father are truly at peace now? Elizabeth had no certain answer, but she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since before her mother's illness. I believe they are, and so perhaps can we be. As they walked away from the property, 3 women now, not frightened children, they carried with them both the burden of their family's dark legacy and the strength that had allowed them to overcome it. Behind them, buried in the earth, the cracked mirror held its prisoner, the binding seals glowing softly beneath the soil, a hidden guardian against horrors beyond human understanding, preserved by the courage of 3 sisters who had faced the darkness and prevailed. Boston, 1923. Elizabeth Whitman stood at the window of her Beacon Hill townhouse, watching the first snowfall of winter dust the cobblestone streets below. At 42, she had built a respectable life as a professor of ancient languages at Radcliffe College, her expertise in obscure texts earning her reluctant admiration even from Harvard's male faculty. The telephone rang, its harsh bell disrupting her reverie. Only a handful of people had her private number. Miss Whitman speaking, she answered. Aunt Elizabeth? The voice was young, tense. It's Samuel. I need to speak with you urgently. Oh, Catherine's son had grown into a serious young man of 21, currently completing his studies at Harvard Medical School like his father. Elizabeth had maintained a close relationship with her nephew, recognizing early the keen intelligence he had inherited from both the Whitman and Ellsworth bloodlines. Samuel, what's wrong? She asked, immediately alert to the distress in his voice. I've been going through grandfather's papers, the ones you gave mother for safekeeping. There's something concerning. Can I come see you tonight? Elizabeth felt a familiar chill. She had shared selected documents with Catherine years ago, sanitized versions that explained enough of their family history to justify the annual pilgrimage to Blackstone without revealing the full horror of what had occurred. Of course. Come at 8. Samuel arrived precisely on time, snow dusting his shoulders and fedora. He carried a leather portfolio that Elizabeth recognized as having belonged to her father. His face, so like Catherine's in its structure, but with Samuel Sr.'s penetrating eyes, was grave. Aunt Elizabeth, he began, after declining offered tea, why didn't you tell us the truth about the Blackstone property, about what's buried there? Elizabeth kept her expression neutral. What truth do you believe you've discovered? Samuel removed several yellowed pages from the portfolio. These were hidden in a false bottom. They appear to be notes grandfather, made about Pastor Gray's teachings. But they don't match the story Mother told me about a tragic fire caused by a deranged minister. Elizabeth sighed. The past, it seemed, refused to remain buried. What else have you found? She asked. Newspaper clippings. Not just about our family, but others, the Putnams in Salem, the Forresters in Maine, the Crawleys in Rhode Island. All families with a widower and daughters, all visited by someone matching Gray's description, all ending in fire and death. Elizabeth moved to her bookshelf and removed a false panel, extracting a journal bound in blue leather. "You've always been too clever for half-truths, Samuel. Here is my account of what really happened, written after we bound the entity in 1905. As Samuel read, his medical training battled with the supernatural implications of his family history. "This can't be possible," he murmured, though without conviction. "You've joined us for the annual ritual at the property since you were 12, Elizabeth reminded him. "Did you never wonder why 3 educated modern women would perform such seemingly superstitious acts?" Samuel closed the journal. "The binding ritual. Mother said it was to honor your parents' memory. It is, in a way. But more importantly, it reinforces the seals that contain something that should never be free. And you believe this entity is still there, after all these years?" Elizabeth's expression hardened. "I know it is. I can feel it when we visit. Diminished, weakened, but waiting. It is patient, Samuel. It thinks in centuries, not years." Samuel was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. Finally, he asked, "Why tell me now?" "I didn't," Elizabeth pointed out. "You came to me. But perhaps it's time. Your mother and Aunt Mary and I won't live forever. Someone of Whitman blood must continue the vigil." The implication hung heavily between them. Samuel ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his grandfather that Elizabeth felt a pang of memory. "There's something else," Samuel said finally. "Something that brought me here tonight, beyond these papers." He hesitated. "I've been having dreams. About a man who says he's my grandfather, standing beside a broken mirror, asking for help." Elizabeth went very still. "How long?" 3 months. They're getting more frequent. Last night he wasn't alone. There were 3 girls with him. They had no faces." Elizabeth moved swiftly to her telephone. "I'm calling your mother and Aunt Mary. We need to leave for Blackstone immediately." "It's just dreams," Samuel protested, though without conviction. "When did you turn 21, Samuel?" Elizabeth asked sharply. "Last month, October 17th. The same day your grandfather invited Pastor Gray into our home 30 years ago." Elizabeth's voice was grim. "The entity is trying a new approach. It couldn't take 3 sisters, so now it's reaching for the next generation of Whitman blood." Within hours, Catherine and Mary had joined them. Catherine, now a doctor's widow at 40, had lost none of her practical determination. Mary, 37, and a respected violin instructor at the conservatory, brought with her the same tools they had used in their binding ritual years before. "A train leaves for Blackstone at midnight," Elizabeth informed them. "We should be there by morning." "The property," Catherine asked urgently. "Have there been any disturbances? Any construction?" "None," Elizabeth assured her. "I had the trust documents drawn explicitly to prevent development for 100 years. The local historical society maintains the memorial garden." Samuel watched this exchange with growing concern. "You truly believe this entity is real? That it's trying to, what, possess me?" Mary placed a gentle hand on her nephew's arm. "What we believe is irrelevant, Samuel. We witnessed something beyond rational explanation. Whether you call it a supernatural entity or a shared delusion doesn't matter. The danger is real." The snowfall had intensified by the time they reached South Station. The train to Blackstone was delayed due to the weather, forcing them to wait in the cavernous terminal among other stranded travelers. "I've brought Father's journal," Catherine told Elizabeth quietly, "and the family Bible. I thought they might help strengthen our connection to him, to whatever part of him might still be fighting against the entity." Elizabeth nodded approval. "Good thinking. Samuel, did you bring the papers you found?" The young man patted his portfolio. "Everything's here." He hesitated. "Aunt Elizabeth, if this thing has been contained for 18 years, why would it be reaching out now?" Before she could answer, a voice announced their train's departure. As they gathered their belongings, Elizabeth considered her nephew's question. Why now, indeed? What had changed? The answer came to her as they boarded. Samuel was the first male descendant since his grandfather. The entity had always targeted family units with a specific structure, a father and daughters. With Samuel's transition to adulthood, perhaps it sensed a new opportunity, a different configuration of Whitman blood. As the train pulled away from Boston, carrying them back to Blackstone and the horror buried beneath their family property, Elizabeth studied her nephew's profile in the dim light. He had the Whitman strength, certainly, but was it enough to resist an entity that had nearly consumed his grandfather? An entity that had been planning its escape for nearly 2 decades. They would know soon enough. Dawn broke over Blackstone with unusual clarity for November. The night's snowfall transformed into crystalline frost that coated every surface. The Whitman family made their way from the station to their ancestral property in silence, each lost in private thoughts. The memorial garden was well maintained, just as Elizabeth had ensured through her trust arrangements. A wrought iron fence surrounded the perimeter, with a small gate bearing the Whitman name. Inside, carefully planned flower beds, now dormant for winter, formed patterns around the old foundation stones. At the center stood the simple marker they had placed 18 years before. But something was wrong. Elizabeth sensed it immediately. "The stone has been moved," she said sharply, pointing to the marker. Indeed, it sat slightly askew on its base, as though someone had attempted to lift it and replaced it imperfectly. Catherine hurried forward, kneeling beside the stone despite the frost. "There are tool marks," she confirmed, running her fingers along fresh scratches in the granite. "Someone has tampered with it." Samuel stood at the gate, suddenly reluctant to enter. "I feel strange," he admitted, "like something's pulling at me." Mary took her nephew's arm. "Stay close to us," she instructed. "Whatever you do, don't approach the marker alone." They entered the garden together, moving cautiously toward the center. Elizabeth carried a bag containing the items they would need to reinforce the binding. Silver wire, blessed salt, and the sacred water she had replenished over the years from the same 7 wells. Who would have done this? Catherine wondered aloud, examining the disturbed earth around the marker. "The locals have always avoided this place." "Not all locals," came a voice from behind them. They turned to find an elderly man, watching them from just inside the gate. His clothes were those of a groundskeeper, but his eyes held an unsettling intelligence. "Mr. Jenkins," Elizabeth acknowledged cautiously. "You're still tending the garden after all these years?" The old man nodded. 50 years I've worked this land. First for your father, then for the trust." He gestured toward the marker. "Been watching it too, especially these past few weeks." "Has someone been here?" Mary asked. Jenkins' weathered face creased with concern. "Group of boys, college types from Boston, called themselves researchers of the paranormal. Came with books and instruments." He spat on the frozen ground. "I ran 'em off twice, but they kept coming back at night." Elizabeth felt cold that had nothing to do with the November air. "When was the last time they were here?" 3 nights ago. Left in a hurry, they did. One of them was bleeding." Samuel had moved closer to the marker, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't articulate. "There's something beneath it," he said, his voice oddly distant. "I can hear it calling." "Samuel!" Catherine moved quickly to her son's side. "Step back from there." Elizabeth addressed Jenkins urgently. "Did they remove anything from the site? Anything at all?" The old man shook his head. "Not that I saw, but they dug some, and they took photographs." Elizabeth made a swift decision. "Mr. Jenkins, we need privacy now, family business. Would you be so kind as to ensure no one disturbs us for the remainder of the day?" Jenkins nodded, understanding more than his simple demeanor suggested. "Always knew this wasn't just a memorial," he said quietly. "Your father was a good man, Miss Whitman. Whatever happened here, it wasn't his doing." As Jenkins departed, Elizabeth turned to her family. We need to check the binding immediately. If those boys disturb the mirror—" They worked quickly, carefully removing the marker to expose the earth beneath. Samuel, despite the strange pull he felt, assisted his mother and aunts in digging through the frozen soil. 6 inches down, they found the first layer of protection, silver coins arranged in a precise pattern, now tarnished black. "The pattern is broken," Mary observed with alarm. "Some coins are missing." "Souvenir hunters," Catherine said bitterly. They continued digging. The next layer, iron filings mixed with salt, appeared mostly intact but disturbed on one side, as though someone had probed through it. Finally, at nearly 2 feet deep, they reached their objective. The mirror lay exactly as they had placed it 18 years before, face down in the earth. But the crack that had once been a single line across its surface had expanded, branching out toward the edges like a spider's web. "Don't touch it," Elizabeth warned as Samuel reached toward it. Not directly. Using tools they had brought for this purpose, they carefully raised the mirror, keeping its reflective surface downward. Even without seeing it, they could feel the malevolent energy pulsing from within. "The binding is weakening," Elizabeth stated grimly. "We need to reinforce it immediately." They prepared a new foundation, lining the hole with fresh salt and iron, adding the silver wire in the pattern Elizabeth had researched. As Mary began the incantation they had used before, Elizabeth prepared the holy water. Samuel watched with a mixture of scientific skepticism and undeniable dread. Despite his medical training, he could not deny the wrongness emanating from the mirror, nor the compulsion he felt to gaze into its cracked surface. "Samuel," his mother said sharply, noticing his fixation, "I need you to read from your grandfather's journal, the passage I've marked." The familiar task anchored him. Samuel opened the journal to the ribbon marker and began reading his grandfather's words aloud, a father's confession and regret, his desperate attempt to save his daughters from an unnatural fate. As he read, something stirred within the mirror. The cracks seemed to shift, realigning themselves like living things beneath the glass. A whisper emerged, not audible, but felt in the mind. "Samuel, grandson, help me." Samuel faltered in his reading. The voice was so like the one in his dreams, pleading, familiar, the voice of blood calling to blood. "Continue, Samuel," Elizabeth commanded, recognizing his hesitation. "It's not your grandfather. It's the thing that consumed part of him." Samuel forced himself to continue reading, but the voice grew more insistent, more seductive, promises of knowledge, of power, of understanding beyond human comprehension. As the reinforcement ritual neared completion, the entity's desperation became palpable. The air around them grew heavy, charged with unnatural electricity. Frost patterns on the surrounding stones shifted into symbols that made the eyes hurt to observe directly. "Now, Samuel," Elizabeth instructed, "place your blood on the mirror's back, just as we did before. A willing sacrifice to seal the binding." Samuel hesitated, the portfolio of his grandfather's papers clutched in his free hand. "There's something else in here," he said suddenly. "Something I found but didn't show you." "This isn't the time," Catherine began. "It's a different ritual," Samuel interrupted. "Not for binding, but for separation. Grandfather was researching it before the end. A way to separate a human essence from an entity that had consumed it." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting, what if part of him is still in there?" Samuel asked urgently. "What if we could free him while keeping the entity bound?" The possibility was tantalizing and dangerous. Elizabeth had long suspected that something of her father remained trapped with the entity, used as bait to lure his descendants. "It's too risky," Catherine insisted. "We stick to the original plan." But Samuel was already reading from the newly discovered ritual, his medical training giving him insight into the precise pronunciation of the Latin and Greek phrases his grandfather had transcribed. The mirror began to vibrate against its bed of protective elements. The cracks glowed with an inner light, first red, then a searing white that forced them to shield their eyes. "Samuel, stop!" Mary cried, but it was too late. A sound like shattering glass filled the air, though the mirror remained intact. Something was breaking free, not escaping, but separating. A column of pale light emerged from the center of the mirror, coalescing into a human form. Samuel Whitman Sr. stood before his daughters and grandson, his form translucent but unmistakable. He appeared as he had before Pastor Gray's influence, clear-eyed, strong, the loving father they remembered from childhood. "My girls," he said, his voice echoing as if from a great distance, "and Samuel, my grandson." His expression was one of profound sorrow and equally profound love. "You've done well, all of you, but the binding weakens." "Father," Elizabeth managed, tears streaming down her face, "is it really you?" The apparition nodded. "Part of me. What remained after my mistake." He turned to Samuel. "You've freed what was left of my consciousness, but the entity remains. And now it will fight harder than ever." As if in response to his words, the mirror began to vibrate more violently. Cracks spread across the back, threatening to break through completely. "The separation ritual has destabilized the binding," the elder Samuel warned. "You must complete it now with all 4 bloodlines." "4?" Catherine questioned. "You 3 daughters and my grandson, the son I never had. Together, you can create a binding the entity can never break." He looked at his grandson with urgent intensity. "But you must choose freely, Samuel. The entity will offer you knowledge, power, answers to questions science cannot yet address. You must reject them all." The young man stood straighter, meeting his grandfather's ethereal gaze. "I choose my family," he said firmly. The apparition smiled. "Then do it now, before it's too late." Elizabeth quickly prepared the final elements of the binding. Each sister pricked her finger, allowing a drop of blood to fall onto the mirror's back. Samuel did the same, completing the square. As the elder Samuel's form began to fade, returning to whatever peace awaited him beyond the entity's prison, he offered a final warning. "It will try again. Not in your lifetimes, perhaps, but eventually. The trust must continue. The bloodline must remember." With these words, he disappeared, leaving only the 4 living Whitmans standing around the mirror. They completed the ritual in renewed silence, each contemplating the responsibility that would now pass through generations. When the mirror was finally reburied, the marker replaced, and the protective elements renewed, they stood together at the edge of the property, exhausted but resolute. "We'll need to create records," Elizabeth said practically, "for future generations. The full truth, hidden but accessible to those of Whitman blood. And I'll have children of my own someday," Samuel added, now fully embracing his place in this generational vigilance. "They'll need to understand their heritage." As they walked away from the property, Elizabeth glanced back one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw 4 figures standing near the marker, her parents and 2 unfamiliar women in antiquated dress. The Putnams, perhaps, or others who had fallen victim before her family. They raised their hands in solemn farewell before fading into the winter light. The binding would hold, for this generation at least, and the Whitman blood would continue, carrying both the burden of vigilance and the strength to maintain it. Deep beneath the frozen earth, sealed in its prison of silver, salt, and sanctified glass, the entity raged against its confinement. But for now, at least, it remained trapped between worlds, denied the vessels it had sought for so many years. The doorway remained closed, the key locked away in Whitman blood, and so it would remain, through the generations to come. A family secret, a sacred duty, a debt repaid through eternal vigilance. Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1967. Professor Elizabeth Whitman closed the leather-bound journal and looked up at the young woman sitting across from her desk. At 86, Elizabeth had long since retired from formal teaching, but she maintained an office at Radcliffe where she occasionally met with selected students. This particular student, however, was far more than an academic protégé. "So now you know the full story, Margaret," Elizabeth said, her voice still sharp despite her advanced years. "The responsibility that comes with your bloodline." Margaret Ellsworth, 21 years old with the unmistakable Whitman eyes, nodded solemnly. The great-granddaughter of Catherine, she had recently discovered the coded references in her family Bible that had led her to her great-great-aunt's door. "The binding has held for 74 years, Elizabeth continued. "Your grandfather Samuel reinforced it faithfully until his passing last year. Now the duty falls to you, as the eldest of the current generation." Margaret smoothed her A-line skirt, a gesture reminiscent of Catherine when she was nervous. "I've had the dreams," she admitted, "since I turned 21 last month. A man who says he's my great-great-grandfather, standing by a broken mirror." Elizabeth's gnarled hands tightened on her cane. Always the dreams, generation after generation. The entity was nothing if not persistent. "They've been more frequent lately," Margaret added. "And there's something else." She hesitated. "Speak freely, child. Nothing you say will shock me. There's been development near the property. An industrial park. The construction crews keep reporting equipment failures when they get close to the boundary. 3 workers have quit, claiming to hear voices. Elizabeth had feared this. Blackstone County had grown significantly in recent decades. The once isolated Whitman property now sat at the edge of expanding commercial zones. The trust had protected the land itself, but it couldn't prevent development on adjacent parcels. "We must visit immediately," Elizabeth decided. "Tomorrow. My sister Mary will meet us there." Mary Whitman, the youngest of the original sisters at 79, had retired from the conservatory but still performed occasionally with a senior orchestra. Catherine had passed away in 1954, but not before ensuring her granddaughter Margaret understood the importance of their family history. The next day, Elizabeth's driver took them to Blackstone. The transformation of the once rural county shocked Margaret, who had not visited since childhood. Strip malls and housing developments had replaced farmland. The road leading to the Whitman property, once a dirt track, was now paved and lined with streetlights. Mary waited for them at the wrought-iron gate, her violinist's hands now gnarled with arthritis, but still strong enough to maintain the protective wards she had reinforced annually for decades. "It's worse than you described, Lizzie," she told her sister as they entered the garden. "Feel it?" Elizabeth nodded. The wrongness emanated from the center of the property, a palpable malevolence stronger than it had been in years. The memorial garden itself remained well tended, protected by the trust funds Elizabeth had established. But beyond its boundaries, change pressed in from all sides. Construction equipment stood idle at the perimeter of the adjacent lot, where the industrial park was expanding. "The vibrations," Mary said with a musician's sensitivity, "the heavy machinery, the blasting. It's all disturbing what lies beneath." They approached the marker, now weathered by decades of New England seasons. Margaret hung back slightly, experiencing for the first time the full force of what her family had contained for generations. "We should check the binding," Elizabeth decided. With Mary's help, she lowered herself carefully to the ground beside the marker. Margaret watched in amazement as these elderly women, whom many might dismiss as fragile, displayed a steely determination that belied their years. Using garden trowels they had brought for the purpose, they began to dig around the marker. Elizabeth's breath caught when they uncovered the first layer of protection. "The silver is completely blackened," she observed, "and look, the pattern is shifting." Indeed, the carefully arranged protective elements seemed to be realigning themselves, as though responding to an unseen force from below. "We need to expose the mirror," Mary said grimly. As they dug deeper, a low humming became audible, not a sound made by any machine, but a vibration that seemed to resonate from the earth itself. Margaret felt it in her teeth, in her bones, a discordant note that made her musical training scream in protest. When they finally reached the mirror, the severity of the situation became clear. The cracks had expanded dramatically, forming a web-like pattern that now covered the entire surface. More disturbing still, the glass seemed to pulse with an inner light, throbbing like a heart. "It's breaking free," Elizabeth whispered. As if in response to her words, the mirror emitted a high-pitched sound. A crack appeared on the exposed edge, new, spreading rapidly across the back of the glass. "Margaret!" Mary called urgently. "We need your blood, now!" The young woman hesitated only briefly before joining her great-aunts. The ritual Elizabeth had described in her account was now happening in real time. The silver wire, the blessed water, the incantations in languages long dead, to all but the most esoteric scholars. As Margaret prepared to add her blood to the ritual, completing the binding as her grandfather and great-grandfather had done before her, a voice seemed to speak directly into her mind. "Free me, Margaret. I can give you what you truly desire." The voice was seductive, offering glimpses of knowledge beyond human understanding, cures for diseases that plagued humanity, insights into the fundamental nature of reality, power that could reshape the world. For a moment, Margaret wavered. Unlike her aunts, she had not witnessed the entity's true nature firsthand. She knew it only through family accounts and her own disturbing dreams. "Margaret!" Elizabeth's sharp voice cut through the telepathic seduction. "Remember who you are. Remember your bloodline." The young woman steeled herself and pressed her finger to the edge of the mirror, allowing a drop of blood to join those of her great-aunts. "By my blood freely given," she recited the words Elizabeth had taught her, "I bind you to this prison. By my will freely offered I seal this doorway." The mirror shuddered violently, then grew still. The pulsing light faded, though the cracks remained, a testament to the entity's persistent efforts to escape. As they carefully reburied the mirror and replaced the protective elements, Elizabeth shared her concerns. "The binding is holding, but it's weakening faster than before. The development around the property, the vibrations from construction, they're all contributing to the destabilization." "What can we do?" Margaret asked. Elizabeth considered the question as they replaced the marker and rose stiffly to their feet. "The trust must be strengthened. The buffer zone around the property expanded." She looked meaningfully at her great-niece. "And you must have children, Margaret. The Whitman bloodline must continue." Margaret, a modern woman with aspirations beyond traditional family roles, bristled slightly at this directive. "And if I choose not to?" Mary touched her arm gently. "Then another of Catherine's line must take up the mantle. But consider this. Without our family's vigilance, what lies beneath would have been free long ago. How many lives would it have destroyed, wearing the faces of those it consumed?" The weight of this legacy settled on Margaret's shoulders as they made their way back to the gate. The industrial park loomed beyond the property line, a symbol of progress that unknowingly threatened to unleash something ancient and malevolent. "I'll do what's necessary," she finally said, "for the binding." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. "Every generation faces its own challenges. Ours was understanding and containing the threat. Yours may be preserving that containment in a world that increasingly presses against the boundaries of the old ways." As they departed, Margaret glanced back at the peaceful-looking garden that concealed such horror. For a moment, she thought she saw figures standing near the marker, not just her great-grandfather, but generations of Whitmans standing vigil over their terrible secret. The entity remained bound, for now. But the modern world, with its construction equipment and disregard for ancient warnings, presented new challenges to the prison that had held for nearly 3/4 of a century. Margaret Ellsworth, the newest guardian of the Whitman legacy, turned away from the vision and faced the future, a future in which her blood and will would be the only barrier between an unsuspecting world and the darkness that waited beneath a cracked mirror, patient and eternal, beneath the pews of a forgotten chapel. The doorway remained closed, but for how long? Only the vigilance of the Whitman blood would determine that answer through the generations yet to come.